thank you very much, Mr. Blair, for meeting with me to talk about Sir Sigmund Sternberg, who is now no longer with us. Can I ask you, this great man, how did you originally come to know him?
I got to know Siggy shortly before I became leader of the Labour Party. He'd obviously been very active in political circles for a long time. He was hugely well respected within the Labour Party and more broadly. And I remember just talking to him generally about the Labour Party and where it was going. And then when I became leader, we obviously became closer. I got to see him more often. And that was the beginning of a long association and friendship, which lasted right up until his death. And he was somebody who was enormously helpful to me, not just in trying to work out how we got the Labour Party into government and stayed in government, but then in later times developed a lot of thinking around interfaith understanding, which became also a big part of my work.
He was an incredible man and very disciplined in his approach. I can remember sitting with him in his living room when sometimes you rang on the phone. And unbelievably, on one occasion you rang and he said that he was engaged and he would ring you back. And I turned and he said, that was Tony Blair. And I said, are you kidding? You hung up on Tony Blair to talk to me. But he said, everything in its place.
Right.
Well, what personal recollections do you have of him?
The thing I remember about Siggy was that he was always absolutely direct and to the point. He didn't sort of waste his time around issues. And he also understood the political leader's life. So he didn't take up time unnecessarily. If he needed to see you, he would see you. He would come to the point, he would make his point, and then he'd go. And he wasn't somebody who, he didn't, it wasn't for him a matter of sort of status or, I want to show who I know. He wasn't like that at all. He was very much somebody who had strong and clear beliefs that were formed over many years, and a lot to do obviously with his upbringing. And he had this strong driving sense of public service. Even though he was a successful businessman, he could have stayed a successful businessman. He could have probably become a more successful businessman. But he was absolutely determined to put something back into society. And he had this, he had this wonderful idea that, which is very much, I think, linked to his background and upbringing, that insofar as he had been successful, the more successful he was, the greater the sense of obligation to put something back.
Absolutely. Can you tell me your view of his personality and his modus operandi and personal values?
He thought through issues in a different way, in a much more detached way than a day-to-day politician will do. And he was very strategic in that thinking. So when he started the interfaith work, this was way before 9/11, it was way before these issues to do with interfaith relations became so central. And he put together, he was one of the pioneers in this, the idea that better relationships between Jewish, Christian and Muslim communities was a central part of future peace and prosperity. And really he was way ahead of his time in this. And the way he managed to galvanize people and get them to sort of unite around...
Never take no for an answer.
Never take no for an answer and unite around common concepts and ideas.
You obviously both had a shared vision about interfaith, his Three Faiths Foundation and your Tony Blair Faith Foundation. And despite the incredible work that both of those organizations have done and do, what is the state of interfaith today, do you think, in this populist, very disjointed, bifurcated world?
There was a problem,
yeah.
Right? And the first step was to acknowledge the problem, and then work out a way of dealing with it that was about peaceful coexistence, about reaching across the boundaries of faith and culture. And he saw very clearly that if you don't deal with it and you leave it as a problem, then it becomes fertile territory. So he was very acute, I think, in understanding that the best way to deal with this burgeoning issue was to make sure that you put it on the table in an honest and forthright way and then set about dealing with it. And that was really his insight,
His key,
which is something that I then took up, and both in my last years as Prime Minister and then after leaving office, this has been a big part of my work.
And this, you're carrying the baton now. And how does the Tony Blair Faith Foundation work today to bring together people of different faiths and no faiths?
The work my foundation does is really around two things. We have practical programs that are education programs that link up young people of different faiths across the world. So these practical programs are the types of things we want to bring to scale and want to be part of the policy, global policy towards this issue. In other words, how do you make sure that young people grow up with an open-minded approach to the world? The second thing we do, though, is we also do research, and we have a daily tracker that tracks extremism across the world and issues to do with extremism, and we produce papers on not just the origins of extremism and how we deal with it, but also what works in countering it. So it's both a think and a do foundation.
Siggy was, of course, a long-standing supporter of the Labour Party and a large contributor, I imagine. Did you ever determine why he was so passionate about the party? And do you have any feeling about what he would have, what did he think, or what do you think he would have thought about the state of things today in the party?
Ziggy was a Labour Party person, I think, partly because of a very profound belief in social justice, but also because he, coming from his background, being someone who'd grown up often with anti-Semitism, he thought and believed that the Labour Party was a more progressive political vehicle, and Siggy was someone absolutely progressive thinking in his heart, mind, and soul, as it were. He always wanted to see the Labour Party do well. He wanted to see it in government, and he wanted to see it stand for this strong belief in powerful intercultural relations. And for most of the time we did. I think today he'd be probably worried by what he sees in some parts of the Labour Party, and he was always incredibly loyal to the Labour Party, but I think he'd want to see it deal with these issues and deal with them in a pretty firm way, because he always thought the Labour Party was the party where whatever your background, race, ethnicity, religion, you could come and feel at home.
I think certainly you were his favorite politician. He actually called you a miracle worker. And he said, and I quote, that you were the best leader in Europe in the last 20 years. He told me that actually he would love to see you return to mainstream politics. Will that ever happen, if I may ask, and if so, when?
I think that's unlikely, frankly. But I'm very motivated by politics at the moment. I think many of the things that Ziggy stood for, which is an open-minded approach to the world, practical solutions, not ideological ones. How do you reach out rather than hunker down? I think he'd be alarmed at what's happening in the world today, at these very strong strains of populism, left and right, that can take us to positions that are isolationist, or on the left anti-business, on the right anti-immigrant. I think he would be worried by that. And the type of politics that Ziggy stood for were really what I think are is the essence of the politics that can work in the 21st century, which is actually to leave aside many of the powerful ideologies of the 20th century and engage in what is genuine, forward-looking, open-minded political engagement. And I think Ziggy would have been both alarmed and motivated by what's happening today. So my own situation is probably the least important aspect of it, but I want to, as I've said, I want to become much more engaged in the political debate again, at least. But frontline politics, I think probably that's unlikely.
So knowing him as I did, if I were Siggy sitting here, I would say to you, well, good, Tony, and specifically, what are you going to do?
What I would like to do is, at the very least, to create a platform on which people of different political backgrounds in terms of party, but shared perspectives in terms of the world, can come together and think about, what are the big ideas for the future? How do we combat this new populism and put in place a more rational, solutions-oriented, evidence-oriented approach to politics? How do we make sure that the world remains open to the opportunities of globalization and not simply anxious about the risks of it and the dangers of it? So, for me, it's about creating a networking and a policy platform that allows me to at least play a part in shaping the debate. And I think right now this is the thing that I can do most effectively, rather than get into a debate about whether I go back in the front line.
So building platforms to do this at an international level, a Middle East level, and a Labour Party level?
Yes, I think Labour Party, and more broadly in the Labour Party, progressive politics. But throughout all of the thread that runs throughout all of the work that I do is this idea that you need an open-minded approach to the world today. Right. That the real difference politically is between the open-minded and the closed-minded. And so whether it's in the Middle East, where the key challenge is how do you get to religiously tolerant societies and cultural acceptance, or it's in the work we do in governance, which is all about how governments become more effective at accessing the best ideas in the world and translating them into practical effect in their countries, or in Western politics, where I think there's a risk that the centre ground gets displaced by this populism left and right, and that will in the end be to the enormous disadvantage of the generations of the future. So the thread that runs throughout my work is that idea that globalization is moving the world closer together. It's an unstoppable force. It's driven by people and not actually by governments. But the key challenge is how do you make it work for people? How do you make it deliver a more just society and not just a society that's more integrated?
How do you think that we got to this strange position, this threat to constitutional democracy here in the UK, these rises of populism, this bifurcation you've referred to? Where, in your expert view, do you think this came out of?
First of all, I think the question as to how this new populism arose is really difficult. It's a really difficult question, and I study it a lot and think about it a lot. And so I give you quite tentative preliminary thoughts, as it were. Sure. I think, first of all, social media is itself a revolutionary phenomenon.
Yes.
It creates a great wall of noise. It has resulted in people tending to go into self-conforming groups that share a particular perspective, that don't really have a conversation outside of that group, and therefore you get politics fragmenting. The conventional media itself is fragmented and become much more polarized. And then I think partly because of that, the centre ground has stopped leading. The centre ground has become managers of the status quo when people want change. Right. And so I think the centre's got to go back to being radical but still practical, forward-looking, but still making change. And
managers.
And they've got to be more than just managing the situation. They've got to be offering ways through, whether it's on challenges to do with immigration or job displacement through technology, or the fact that in a globalized world, the power of individual nations to affect their future is reduced. We've got to be providing answers, otherwise people are just going to ride the anger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blair. Thank you, sir. On behalf of Siggy and his family, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you very much. All the best.
You too.